Hey everyone, today we're going to be going over the last installment of our Elements of Literature notes. So before we begin, just a couple of reminders for you. So over the course of this unit, we have been looking at the elements of literature because we have been applying the formalist lens. Now that simply means that we are analyzing stories by interpreting the key elements of the text. So we have already talked about things like conflict, plot, characterization. We've talked about point of view, theme, and irony. And today we're going to be talking about setting, characters, foreshadowing, and symbolism. So like I said, these are the four elements that we'll talk about today. Let's begin with setting. So now first, I feel like setting is one of those elements of literature that we learn right away in elementary school. We know that setting is the time and place of the story. We know that setting should answer the following questions. Where does the story take place? What time of day or year is it? And even what is the weather like? But now that we're in high school, we're going to be using this setting to analyze the story in a deeper way. So we're going to look at how setting can be used to enhance the short story's emotional effect, how setting can build the conflict within the story, and also how conflict can reveal character traits. So we're going to talk about each one of those effects in the next few slides. So first, like I said, setting can affect or enhance the emotional effect of the story. So let's look at an example of that. So when we read The Interlopers in our short story unit, The Interlopers takes place in the Carpathian Mountains in a stolen forest on a cold winter night. So over the next few slides, we're going to talk about how that specific setting has impacted the overall story. So now, like I said, setting can enhance the emotional effect of the story. So on the bottom of this slide here, I have a couple of questions that I want you to consider. First, how do these things impact the emotional effect? So that is basically like asking you, what feelings do we experience when we read the story because of that setting? Also, how would the emotional effect be different if the story took place in a flowery spring meadow? Okay, when we really look at answering these questions, we probably are going to say that this setting kind of gives us an eerie or cool or somber feeling as we read that story. If this story was to take place on a flowery or in a flowery spring meadow, we'd probably feel a little bit lighter. Okay, so this setting can actually enhance the emotional effect of the story. Setting can also be used to build the conflict within the story. So again, we're looking at the interloper still. The setting is the Carpathian Mountains, a stolen forest on a cold winter's night. So now let's look at answering these questions together. The first question says, how does the fact that this story takes place in a stolen forest add to the conflict? Well, it's the basis of the conflict. Our two characters are fighting over the land, and without that stolen forest concept, those characters have nothing to fight about, and so the conflict would disappear. Also, how would the events of the story, would the events of the story still happen if the story would have taken place in a flowery spring meadow? Would the tree still fall? Would the men still make peace? The answer to these questions is probably not. So setting really can help build that conflict, and it can help lead the events in the story to take place. And the last effect of setting is that setting can reveal character traits. Again, we're still talking about The Interlopers, which takes place in the Carpathian Mountains in a stolen forest on a cold winter's night. Okay, now again, a couple of questions to ask yourself. What might the fact that Ulrich is guarding the forest on a cold winter's night suggest about his personality? Okay, it might suggest that he is dedicated and diligent and really protective of the things that are his. Another question, what might the fact that Georg is trespassing on stolen land say about his personality? That might suggest that he doesn't care what the law says. Remember, the court of law said, Georg, this land is not yours, but he still trespasses anyway. So that might reveal that he doesn't really have respect for authority, and he feels like that land belongs to him. So again, setting can play a really big role in terms of how the story plays out. The next element of literature that I want to talk to you about are characters. So we know that characters are the people in the story, poem, or play that we read. Over the next few slides, I'm going to cover important terms that I want us to know. So we'll talk about protagonist, antagonist. We'll also talk about the different types of characters. So we'll look at dynamic and static, and round and flat characters. So now just a couple of reminders before we go. We are also going to be looking at characters' motivation. So characters need motivation or reasons for their behavior and actions, and motivation can be anything like vengeance, love, fear, greed, etc. So now on the next 3 slides, we're really looking at a spectrum of characters. So the first topic that we want to discuss is the protagonist versus the antagonist. So the protagonist is typically the main character of the story. This is the person who sets the plot in motion, and we're going to follow them over the course of the text. Now typically, this person is the hero. I say typically because there's actually been kind of a trend in film and literature to follow the anti-hero. So typically the protagonist is a good person, but that's not always the case. Now the antagonist is any character or force who blocks the protagonist. I want to emphasize that word force. An antagonist does not always have to be a living thing. When we talked about our conflict, we talked about character versus nature. Okay, a character could be struggling against a natural force in order to survive. So again, an antagonist can be a character or a force. It's anything that prevents the protagonist from doing what they've set out to do. Now typically, the antagonist is viewed as the villain, but that's not always the case because of that trend in media that I've just mentioned. An example of this would be in the Hunger Games, where Katniss is fighting against President Snow. Now the next item on the spectrum that I want to look at is dynamic versus static characters. Okay, a dynamic character is one who changes as a result of the events of the story. So a dynamic character is going to change their beliefs, their opinions, emotions, or behavioral patterns because of what's happened to them during the story. A static character is a character who does not change much over the course of the story. Okay, you can kind of remember that by using the chant, static stays the same, static stays the same. They do not change much over the course of the text. An example of that is The Most Dangerous Game. At the beginning of that story, Rainsford really believed in hunting, and he didn't care about how the animal felt while being hunted. However, as soon as he became someone who was hunted himself, his attitudes towards hunting really changed. Now Zoroff, on the other hand, is a character who was static. He believed that the strong was meant to hunt the weak. Okay? That belief stayed the same over the course of the text. Next, I want to talk to you about round versus flat characters. A round character is a character with many different traits. So we understand their motivation, why they do the things that they do, and we understand their perspective, the way they feel about certain things. A flat character is a character who only has a few traits. So we could describe them in just a few words, and so we might not really understand their motivation or their perspective. Again, an example of this is The Most Dangerous Game, where Rainsford is a round character. There are a lot of different terms that we could use to describe his personality. Ivan, on the other hand, Zoroff's servant, is a flat character. We don't really know anything about him. We know what he looks like, and we know that he serves Zoroff. But other than that, we can't really understand his perspective or his motivation. The next element of literature I want to talk to you about is foreshadowing. So foreshadowing is the use of clues that hint at events that will occur later in the plot. I like to think of foreshadowing as that warning sign. Now, foreshadowing is used to build suspense, anxiety, and intrigue in the reader. Typically, when we get foreshadowing, we want to continue reading so we know what's going to happen next. Now, authors will use a lot of different varieties of foreshadowing in the text, but the most common types of foreshadowing are prophecy, where a respected elder is going to send some sort of message about something that could occur. The use of flashbacks, or looking back in time. Dialogue, so for instance, a character might give an ominous comment that hints at something that might happen. We could have ominous or spooky characters or objects that kind of give us that feeling of foreshadowing. And also the use of storms. Okay, all of these things hint at something that's going to happen later in the text. So for instance, we're going to be reading And Then There Were None for our mystery novel. And in that story, there's a poem that's read at the beginning that foreshadows events that's going to happen over the course of the text. And this is our last element of literature that I want to talk to you about. This is symbolism. So symbolism is simply the use of symbols or objects that represent ideas, concepts, emotions, or a state of mind. So now, symbols are really important to pay attention to in literature because when we identify the symbols being used in the text, we can understand its meaning, which helps us understand the story at a deeper level. An example of symbol, when we read the necklace, we saw that there was a fake diamond necklace, and that can represent superficial values or greed. So as we read stories in the future, I want you to try to pay attention to the use of objects in the text because they could be used as symbols that represent a bigger idea. And that concludes our Elements of Literature talk. If you have any questions about anything that I've talked to you about in this video, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks for watching, everyone.